TIK History is a military history YouTuber well known for citing sources explicitly in his videos, frequently including full quotations on screen and pointing to a lengthy list of references linked to in his video description. But TIK doesn't always check his sources for accuracy, so he's sometimes misled by them, and he passes false history on to you. In a previous video, I demonstrated TIK's ignorance of both Gnosticism and the 12th century Italian abbot Joachim of Fiore, which was a result of him being badly led astray by both culture warrior James Lindsay, who is extremely ignorant about both subjects, and a mid-20th century political philosopher called Eric Voegelin, who wrote with great confidence about Gnosticism despite having almost no knowledge of the subject. In this video, we'll see just why Eric Voegelin was a terrible source for TIK to rely on, and we'll perform the due diligence of fact-checking TIK's source, which TIK himself completely failed to do. TIK hasn't validated his main source. In the 1930s, German philosopher Eric Voegelin was one of a number of scholars seeking to understand the rise of modernity and the apparently contradictory emergence of totalitarianism after centuries of Enlightenment and liberal thought. Under the influence of other scholars, whom we'll come to shortly, Voegelin became convinced that Gnosticism was the cause of modern totalitarianism. As we've seen in the previous video, TIK is getting his ideas about Gnosticism and politics from Voegelin. He makes this explicit in his video, saying, quote, "Hardly anyone had identified the actual religion that was behind National Socialism. Eric Voegelin had in the 1930s and onwards, but he seems to have been the exception to the rule," end quote. Hearing that was an immediate red flag for me. Anyone writing about Gnosticism in the 1930s would have been almost completely ignorant of the topic. At that time, there were almost no Gnostic texts available at all. Most of what was available about Gnosticism at that time was in the form of statements and claims, typically extremely critical, in the writings of early Christian leaders opposing what they considered heresy, but all of that consisted of less than 70 pages. Additionally, these Christian writers were highly unreliable sources for Gnosticism, partly because there was no guarantee they actually understood what they were reading due to Gnosticism's secretive nature, and partly due to the fact that they were theologically motivated to depict Gnostic ideas as negatively as possible. Consequently, the information available from these Christian writers was unreliable and heavily distorted. Outside the Christian writers, up until 1945, there were only about 9 or 10 actual Gnostic texts available, providing extremely little information about Gnosticism. In 1945, a huge collection of texts was found in Egypt, sealed in clay jars. This collection became known as the Nag Hammadi Library, after the name of the nearby village. Many of the texts were Gnostic, providing valuable insights into Gnosticism. But the process of their publication and translation was very slow. By 1965, only a fraction of them had been read and edited, and less than 10% had been translated into English. So when Voegelin was writing about Gnosticism in the 1930s, he was working almost completely in the dark, without access to reliable sources. He had practically no knowledge of real Gnosticism or access to genuine Gnostic texts. Consequently, he was heavily dependent on secondary sources, in particular Swiss theologian Hans Urs von Balthasar, who wrote an introduction to the work of the 2nd century Christian Irenaeus of Lyon, who critiqued Gnosticism, and German philosopher Hans Jonas, who was studying Gnosticism from the texts available to him. Voegelin borrowed the very idea of a connection between Gnosticism and modern political ideology from the work of Hans Jonas. Voegelin's reliance on these secondary sources, which were themselves highly uninformed about Gnosticism, led him into many errors. One was the false idea of the historical transmission of Gnosticism from antiquity to the modern era, and the other was his false understanding of Gnosticism itself, which is significantly different to what we find in actual Gnostic texts, and is based not so much on actual Gnostic ideas, but more on Vogelin's understanding of religious and secular concepts of an imminent end of the age, preceded by a great crisis and succeeded by an era of utopian renewal. TIK doesn't mention any of this, quite possibly because he simply doesn't know much about Vogelin, or the source of his ideas, or what Vogelin actually wrote. Vogelin's understanding of Gnosticism was very generalized and is summarized by scholar of Gnosticism Fryderyk Kwiatkowski as, quote, a radical dissatisfaction with the organization of the world, which is considered evil and unjust, and aims to provide certainty and meaning to human's life through the acquisition of gnosis, end quote. This gnosis, Kwiatkowski explains, is, quote, the inner knowledge of the self, its origins, and destiny, end quote. That's a definition of Gnosticism which is vague enough to apply to most of those dodgy self-help books of the 1980s. Professor Emeritus Eugene Webb summarizes Vogelin's understanding of Gnosticism in more detail as, quote, 1. Dissatisfaction with one's situation. 2. Belief that the reason the situation is unsatisfactory is that the world is intrinsically poorly organized. 3. Salvation from the evil of the world is possible. 4. If the order of being is changed. 5. And this is possible in history. 6. If one knows how. Gnosis is the knowledge about how, end quote. Even with Webb's more detailed summary of Vogelin's understanding of Gnosticism, and this is an excellent summary, you should be able to see that this is still such a vague description that it could be applied to many different ideologies, especially since it completely lacks any of the supernatural elements which are critical to Gnosticism. Vogelin believed that at the core of Gnosticism was the desire for a re-divinization of humans and their society, meaning a recapturing of the idea and sense of humans and society as divine, though not necessarily in a supernatural sense, and not necessarily in the sense of people becoming literal divine beings or gods. In his response to Vogelin, political philosopher Hans Kelsen wrote, quote, what he reports as the main contribution of Joachim of Flora has nothing specifically Gnostic in it, end quote, adding, quote, but why does Vogelin call Joachim's theology of history Gnosticism? The reader will find no direct and explicit answer to this question, end quote. Although noting a, quote, certain similarity, end quote, between religious views of a future utopia and the Marxist view of inevitable communism, Kelsen wrote, quote, but this religious scheme has nothing to do with Gnosticism, nor with Joachim's Trinity speculation, end quote. Even stronger, Kelsen insisted, quote, to interpret the rationalist, outspoken anti-religious, anti-metaphysical philosophy of Feuerbach and Marx as mystic Gnosticism, to speak of a Marxian transfiguration of man into God, and to say of the atheistic theory of Marx that it carries to its extreme a less radical medieval experience which draws the spirit of God into man while leaving God himself in his transcendence, is, to formulate it as politely as possible, a gross misinterpretation, end quote. You'll find that kind of comment a lot in modern scholarship on Vogelin's views of Gnosticism. As politely as possible, they tell you very frankly that Vogelin didn't know what he was talking about. As we've seen, TIK believes that Gnosticism is part of, in his words, quote, an old religion that spans back to the dawn of human history, end quote, saying, quote, there is a continuation of ideas from ancient Egypt and Assyria all the way up to Marx and Hitler, end quote. However, TIK does not tell us that Vogelin himself did not believe this. In fact, Vogelin believed that Gnosticism dates to about the 4th century of our era, arising within Christianity around the time of Constantine the Great. I'm guessing TIK doesn't realize this because he hasn't really read very much of Vogelin. According to Vogelin, the Christian conquest of the Roman Empire led to, quote, the de-divinization of the temporal sphere of power, end quote, resulting in turn in the idea that, quote, the specifically modern problems of representation would have something to do with a re-divinization of man and society." End quote. In Vogelin's view, it was this desire to form a system of re-divinization which resulted in Gnosticism, and it is this originally Christian Gnosticism which Vogelin believed was inherited by modern society in the 20th century. Vogelin writes explicitly, quote, "Modern re-divinization has its origins rather in Christianity itself, deriving from components that were suppressed as heretical by the Universal Church." End quote. So if TIK wants to hold on to his idea that Gnosticism is an ancient religion with its roots in the dawn of time, predating Rome, Greece, Egypt and Sumer, then he'll have to look elsewhere for support, since Vogelin can't help him with that. I wonder what he'll use. We've already seen him appeal rather vaguely to Plato, but of course that wasn't any evidence at all. Ironically, given his general ignorance of Gnosticism, Vogelin turned out to be correct about Gnosticism emerging after Christianity. After decades of Gnostic studies, much archaeological research, and countless papers examining all available textual sources, the mainstream scholarly consensus is that there is no evidence that Gnosticism exists earlier than Christianity. We'll deal with that in the next section of this video. Vogelin did believe that the early Gnostics, who he believed were thoroughly Christian, were opposed and suppressed by the Christian institution we know today as the Roman Catholic Church, and that's actually the mainstream scholarly consensus today. However, Vogelin also believed that the Gnostic teachings were preserved and transmitted down through time by writers such as the unidentified 6th century Neoplatonist philosopher known to scholars as Pseudo-Dionysius the Areopagite, the 9th century Irish philosopher John Scotus, and of course the 12th century Italian abbot Joachim of Fiore. However, this is absolutely not supported by the scholarly consensus. Vogelin was so uninformed about Gnosticism and had so little access to Gnostic texts that he totally misled his own readers about the best sources on the subject, claiming, quote, "Gnostic heresy was the great opponent of Christianity in the early centuries, and Irenaeus surveyed and criticized the manifold of its variants in his Adversus Haeresis, circa 180, a standard treatise on the subject that still will be consulted with profit." End quote. Even at the time Vogelin was writing this, in 1952, this was a laughably false statement. Irenaeus was a bishop in Lyon, now in France, whose book was just a collection of any ideas he considered to be theologically suspect and outside the boundary of correct Christianity. Firstly, it's important to note that Irenaeus didn't actually write of, or even think in terms of, Gnostics. Most of his writings were against the group called the Valentinians, who held some beliefs which modern scholars have retrospectively categorized as Gnostic, but whose actual system of belief is extremely convoluted and highly syncretic, mixing Christian beliefs with Greek philosophy and possibly also Egyptian mythology, since Valentinus himself was born in Egypt and seems to use or allude to some Egyptian terms. It's hard to even systematize what the Valentinians believed from the work of Irenaeus himself, since we don't really know what his sources are, and he doesn't identify who he spoke with or what he read. Most of what he wrote about the Valentinians isn't what people commonly think of as Gnosticism today. A very great deal of his arguments against the Valentinians comprises his objection to them finding ridiculously complicated number patterns in the Bible and interpreting individual names and even random words in the Bible as if they all had some kind of almost infinite depth of spiritual significance. They even take physical descriptions of objects in the Bible and assign a theological meaning to each different part of them. So, no. The book by Irenaeus is by no means a standard treatise on Gnosticism. It's Irenaeus' own personal objections to the Valentinians, some of whose beliefs are retrospectively classified as Gnostic, but whom he refers to as the followers of Valentinus. There are Gnostic elements in amongst all this, but it's an extremely narrow cross-section of what was really a far broader network of Gnostic beliefs. It's a mere pinhole glimpse into unorthodox Christian beliefs during the time of Irenaeus. Kwiatkowski explains that Vogelin was also influenced by writers such as Henri Charles Puech and Hans Soderberry, noting, quote, Both scholars claimed there was a continuity of Gnostic ideas from antiquity into the Middle Ages." End quote. These men did most of their work in this area before the 1980s. In fact, Puech died in 1983, when Gnostic studies were only just starting to mature with the publication of the Nag Hammadi texts, which didn't even start properly until the early 1970s and wasn't completed until 1977. So these scholars were working with hardly any genuine Gnostic material. Since then, the Nag Hammadi texts have been re-edited and republished, and I wouldn't even trust my own edition of the 1978 English translation unless I had checked it with the latest scholarship on the subject. Of course, these scholars on whom Vogelin depended were incorrect. These days, it is recognized that some of the medieval heretical groups, such as the Cathars and Bogomils, probably had various forms of strong dualist beliefs, but scholars have long since recognized that a dualistic belief system, even a strong, dualistic, mystic Christian belief system, is not synonymous with Gnosticism. That was precisely the simplistic view which led earlier scholars astray. The 2020 online encyclopedia Iranica, published by the academic press Brill, introduces its article on the Cathars, Albigensians, and Bogomils by noting, quote, "The commonly held view that late classical Manichaeism experienced a revival in the 11th century, and that in the 3.5 centuries between 1000 and 1350 it spread in Europe, where its followers were known as Cathars, has often been repeated both in scholarly and popular accounts." End quote. Of course, it's worth noting that the Catholic Church at the time didn't call these people Gnostics either. They were called Paulicans, Arians, and Manichaeans, but not Gnostics. These would be very strange names to call these groups if they actually were Gnostics, and if Gnostic beliefs and groups had genuinely been preserved from antiquity through the Middle Ages. But, of course, they weren't Gnostics, and no one called them that. They weren't even called Valentinians. As the Encyclopedia Iranica notes, quote, "Manichaean was used as a label for heretics from about the year 1000 onwards," end quote. Very importantly, the article goes on to say, quote, "Manichaeism is said to have been passed via the Paulicans and the Bogomils to re-emerge in the European Cathars, but as we shall see, this supposed historical transmission is difficult to demonstrate," end quote. And remember, that's Manichaeism, which dates from the 3rd century, let alone Gnosticism. So, apart from gesturing vaguely at the works of earlier writers who made unsubstantiated claims, how did Vogelin support his own argument that the Gnostics had survived antiquity and that their beliefs had been transmitted throughout the Middle Ages all the way up to the 20th century? Simple. He didn't. Kwiatkowski says, quote, "Being unable to give any historical proof to support this view, Vogelin resorts to the following evasive statement," and here he quotes Vogelin. "The economy of this lecture does not allow a description of the gnosis of antiquity or of the history of its transmission into the Western Middle Ages. Enough to say that at the time, gnosis was a living religious culture on which men could fall back." End quote. That's quite a hand wave. Imagine making a huge argument that Gnosticism had somehow survived over 1,800 years from the 2nd to the 20th century, and then, at the point at which it would be really helpful to provide evidence for this massive claim, suddenly resorting to, "I don't have time to tell you how it happened, just trust me, bro." Remember, this is the source TIK is relying on for his entire video. TIK's relying on, "Trust me, bro." Kwiatkowski goes on to note that since Vogelin didn't have any evidence for Gnosticism surviving from antiquity to the Middle Ages, he had to jump to the 12th century abbot Joachim of Fiore, as we've seen previously, try to represent him as a Gnostic, and then attempt to build a historical continuity of Gnosticism from Joachim to the 20th century. As we saw in the previous video, that was a dismal failure which isn't taken seriously by mainstream scholarship. TIK is wrong about Gnosticism. In this section, we're going to see that TIK's poor use of sources has led him completely astray. He identifies his reliance on a video by the new atheist and conservative culture critic James Lindsay. TIK tells us, quote, Now, Lindsay is getting a portion of his information from this book, Gnosis and Hermeticism, From Antiquity to Modern Times. This is a real academic book written by numerous professors and so on, with sources and citations, and I'm saying this to make it clear to everyone that I'm not just making this up." End quote. Yes, this is a real academic book written by numerous professors with sources and citations, and I wish TIK had actually read it. Instead, it seems he is just relying on what Lindsay says about it. As we will see, TIK completely misunderstands the book as a result. TIK tells us, quote, "And in this book, one of the authors says that since the 1800s, the West has been dominated by three groups. There's the Christian churches, the intellectuals who believe in science, and then a third group of occultists. These three groups have all been fighting against each other, in spirit if not physically, and that these occultists are part of this ancient religion." End quote. That's not quite true, and that's being polite. The book actually says there has been a third tradition, not religion, and that, quote, "this tradition emphasized the importance of inner enlightenment or gnosis, a revelatory experience that mostly entailed an encounter with one's true self as well as with the ground of being, God." End quote. Importantly, the authors go on to say, quote, "In antiquity, this perspective was represented by Gnostics and Hermetists. In the Middle Ages, by several Christian sects." End quote. In other words, they differentiate between the Gnostics, the Hermetists, and various Christian sects, identifying them not as all belonging to the same religion, contrary to TIK's claim, but as sharing the same general idea of seeking inner enlightenment through a personal encounter with oneself and with God. Note that the authors only identify this as the common tradition shared by these three groups, nothing else. Note also that they say this tradition was represented by the Gnostics and Hermetists in antiquity, that is, roughly the period of European history from the 6th century BCE to the 15th century. Just a note here for anybody who wants to get pedantic. I know that historical periodization is an art more than a science, and there are several periodization schema in popular use in scholarship. The one I've just used is found fairly broadly in scholarly literature, and it's easy enough to understand for a popular audience. We can have the argument about the exactitudes of historical periodization in another video. Later, we find that the authors of this book to which TIK refers identify Gnosticism as belonging to the period of antiquity up to approximately the fall of Rome, and the Hermetists as existing longer, up to the Middle Ages. The point here is that they don't identify the Gnostics and the Hermetists as identical, or both sharing one religion called Gnosticism. They regard the Gnostics as a movement in the distant past which died out, and the Hermetists as a separate movement which emerged later, and regard the two movements as having only a very general shared concept of this inner enlightenment through a personal encounter with oneself and with God. The scholars who wrote this book don't believe any of these traditions had an ancient history stretching back to the dawn of time, or as part of one ancient religion or religious movement. Of course, the authors do not regard Hermeticism as a religion either. For our enlightenment, TIK provides this definition of Gnosticism. Quote, "Under Gnosticism, you now know that there was a tragic split in the heavens. For reasons we won't get into, the true God split into many pieces. Man was created during this split, but so was a false god known as the Demiurge. The Demiurge, or devil if you want to call him that, created the material universe as a prison for the soul of man. So your body is a prison. The world around us is a false reality. We are living in the Matrix, apparently. And now that the true God has implanted this nonsense into your head, your goal is to transcend the real world to reunite with God." End quote. He probably pulled that partly from James Lindsay and partly from Vogelin, but however he came up with it is irrelevant since it's wildly inaccurate. TIK believes there was a specific religion called Gnosticism with this specific set of core beliefs, so this is what we can call a summary of the Gnostic religion. In reality, mainstream scholars have found that the more Gnostic texts they discover, the more inconsistent, incoherent, and contradictory they are in relation to each other. Professor of Theology Feem Perkins writes, quote, Gnosticism did not originate as a well-defined philosophy or set of religious doctrines, nor did its teachers compose authoritative texts to replace the traditional Jewish and Christian scriptures. Therefore, the themes which recur from one text to the next are subject to considerable variation. End quote. In an article entitled Vogelin's Gnosticism Reconsidered, Webb, cited previously, explains in comprehensive detail how inaccurate and outdated Vogelin's understanding of Gnosticism was, explaining, quote, to begin with, we have to recognize something that Vogelin himself would have recognized as a major issue, that the whole idea of there being a Gnosticism, conceived of as a movement with some kind of coherent core of beliefs, is a modern construction, end quote. Yes, the whole idea of a specific set of Gnostic beliefs, conveniently wrapped up in a tidy dogma such as described by TIK, is a modern invention created by over-enthusiastic scholars systematizing various scraps of wildly different texts. Webb explains in considerable detail just how massively diverse Gnostic beliefs were, writing, quote, some texts trace a dualism back to the roots of all being, before demiurges. Some describe demiurges who are evil from the start and produce all later evil, although no information is given about whether or not they themselves derive from evil principles. Some talk about demiurges who fell away from an original monistic perfection, or who began as good but later revolted. Some demiurgic myths are not anti-cosmic, but treat the cosmos as having a proper place in the greater scheme, end quote. As if that wasn't enough, he goes on to describe even more differences between Gnostics, writing, quote, in some, the devolution of the demiurges is part of a providential divine plan aimed at an ultimate good. Some talk about demiurges who are not evil but good, or who grow into goodness. Some express hostility to the body, while others talk about the perfection of the human and speak favorably of the body. Some urge asceticism, and some are not ascetic, end quote. But there's still more. Webb continues, quote, although some texts do speak of some individuals as members of a spiritual race, pneumatics, there is no solid evidence that their authors really thought in terms of a deterministic elitism in which the pneumatics were predestined for salvation without the need for striving and achievement. In fact, some even talk as though the potential to belong to the spiritual race is universal and open to development in everyone, end quote. This is very easily verifiable if you look at standard scholarship on Gnosticism. For up-to-date information, I would strongly recommend reading academic works on Gnosticism published no earlier than the year 2000, since the field has changed so dramatically in the last 40 years, especially with the recognition of both Christian and non-Christian Gnostic writings, the latter often highly syncretic mashups of Greek and Egyptian religious ideas. Some scholars have despaired so greatly over the almost completely irreconcilable differences between the texts traditionally regarded as Gnostic that they have recommended the entire term should be retired as functionally useless, since broadening it to include all these texts would make it so vague as to be meaningless. Already in 1996, Professor of Comparative Religion Michael Williams published a book entitled Rethinking Gnosticism, an argument for dismantling a dubious category, in which he wrote, quote, what is today usually called ancient Gnosticism includes a variegated assortment of religious movements that are attested to in the Roman Empire at least as early as the 2nd century CE, end quote. Adding, quote, the chapters that follow raise questions about the appropriateness and usefulness of the very category Gnosticism itself as a vehicle for understanding the data under discussion, end quote. Williams explained, quote, there is no true consensus, even among specialists in the religions of the Greco-Roman world, on a definition of the category Gnosticism, even though there is no reason why categories as such should be difficult to define, end quote. He added, and I apologize for the long quotation, quote, to be sure, some of the elements often incorporated into definitions of Gnosticism are, in themselves, reasonably clear. For example, ancient Gnosticism is frequently defined as including the notion that the material cosmos was created by one or more lower demiurges, from the Greek demiurgos, craftsman, fashioner, creator. that is, by an entity or entities lower than and distinct from the most transcendent God or order of being. But by itself, this feature has never been viewed as sufficient to define Gnosticism." End quote. I know that was a lengthy quotation, but I felt it was important to read it in full because it demonstrates how completely out of date TIK's understanding of Gnosticism really is. And remember, that was a book from back in 1996, and TIK is relying on an understanding of Gnosticism derived almost completely from an author who wrote back in 1952 who was virtually ignorant of the subject. At this point, we need to examine TIK's claim that Gnosticism is, in his words, quote, "an old religion that spans back to the dawn of human history," end quote, and that, quote, "there is a continuation of ideas from ancient Egypt and Assyria all the way up to Marx and Hitler," end quote. We've already seen that Eric Voegelin himself didn't believe this, and we've also seen that there's no evidence for Gnosticism being preserved from antiquity all the way to Joachim of Fiore and then transmitted through the centuries to the modern era. Even Voegelin couldn't find any, and had to skip over that part of his historical analysis very hurriedly as a result. But there's also absolutely no evidence for Gnosticism any earlier than Christianity. Even over 20 years ago, in 2001, American theologian Thomas R. Schreiner wrote that although previous scholars had believed there was evidence in the New Testament for 1st century and possibly pre-Christian Gnosticism, quote, "virtually no one advocates the Gnostic hypothesis today," end quote. When Gnostic texts were discovered in the Nag Hammadi library, it was anticipated by some that they would finally provide clear evidence for pre-Christian Gnosticism. However, it was gradually discovered that the Gnostic texts in the Nag Hammadi collection date back no further than the 2nd century, with some possibly drawing on sources from the 1st century. As early as 1959, American archaeologist Merrill Unger wrote, quote, "Egypt has yielded earlier written evidence of Jewish, Christian, and pagan religion. It has preserved works of Manichaean and other Gnostic sects, but these are all considerably later than the rise of Christianity," end quote. Years later, in 1992, German scholar of Gnosticism Kurt Rudolph wrote that most of the Nag Hammadi texts were, quote, "now dated to the 2nd and 3rd centuries," end quote, adding that some of them may be drawing on literary sources dating back to the 1st century. In 2000, scholar of Christian origins Paul Marecki wrote that although some researchers had suggested a number of Christian texts from the 1st and 2nd centuries may contain evidence that the authors knew of religious beliefs which might have been Gnostic, quote, "even here the issues discussed are diverse, demonstrating a complex assortment of competing new religious movements, but no evidence of Gnosticism," end quote. By 2003, New Testament scholar James Dunn could write confidently, quote, "it is now widely agreed that the quest for a pre-Christian Gnosticism, properly so called, has proved to be a wild goose chase," end quote. Similarly, in 2007, New Testament scholar George McRae commented on the Nag Hammadi texts, writing, quote, "and even if we are on solid ground in some cases in arguing the original works represented in the library are much older than extant copies, we are still unable to postulate plausibly any pre-Christian dates," end quote. If TIK wants to argue for the existence of pre-Christian Gnosticism as an ancient religion reaching back into the dawn of history, transmitted to medieval writers such as Joachim of Fiore, and handed down from him to the modern era, then he needs to provide actual evidence for it, and ideally he needs to cite mainstream scholarship and address the mountains of evidence which has been collected indicating Gnosticism arose from within Christianity as a reactionary movement. Referring again to that scholarly work he heard about from James Lindsay, TIK tells us, quote, "these authors explain that the ancient Roman Christians were fighting against this religion. St. Augustine was a member of this religion for 10 years before converting away from it, at least partly. The Inquisition was created specifically to fight against this religion, which it did for centuries," end quote. It's true that the early Christians contested with the Gnostics, and it's also true that Augustine was a Gnostic originally. But what TIK doesn't understand is that Gnosticism was practically dead by the 4th century and extinct shortly afterwards. As for that scholarly book to which he refers, and remember, the book is good, it's just that TIK is misrepresenting it because he hasn't read it, the entire book contains only 3 references to the Inquisition. None of them say the Inquisition was created specifically to fight against this religion, or that it did for centuries. Additionally, as I have already explained, no one in the book identifies Gnosticism and Hermeticism as a single religion at all. The fact is, Gnosticism was almost extinct by the 4th century. Virtually all of the currently extant Gnostic texts date no later than the 3rd century, and the evidence from writers such as Epiphanius of Salamis and Victorinus indicates that Gnosticism was essentially a spent force by the 4th century, with only a couple of works cited as written during this period. The Valentinians were the last major Gnostic school, and they had virtually died out by the 3rd century, receiving only scattered mentions into the 5th century. But even by this stage, only trace remnants of Valentinian Gnosticism were preserved. The formally organized groups had long since expired. Researcher of religion Daniel Merker writes, quote, "With the exception of the Mandaeans of Iraq, who have survived to the present day, Gnosticism has been extinct for centuries." End quote. That was written back in 1993. And these days, with scholarship being more strict on definitions and more discerning about what is and isn't Gnosticism, there's a lot more debate as to whether or not the Mandaeans hold any actually distinctive Gnostic beliefs. Returning to the death of Gnosticism, Professor Emeritus of Systematic Theology and Ethics Terence Thiessen writes, quote, "Gnosticism died out ultimately not because of the effective attacks on its teachings, but because of its failure to develop an integrated social structure like that of the Orthodox Church." End quote. This is ironic, since it demonstrates that Gnosticism failed to survive precisely because it was not a socially binding infrastructure like a political ideology. This is due in part to the fact that Gnosticism was essentially a private religion, like the pagan mystery cults of Greek and Roman antiquity. Placing great emphasis on the secret transmission of hidden knowledge, Gnostics wrote texts which they claimed provided the real facts about life and the universe, and unveiled the truth about religious beliefs. This is why so many Gnostic texts were written claiming to reveal information which Christians weren't telling anyone. Christian Gnostic writers would take a Christian text, such as a book of the New Testament, and write a supposed secret version which taught the real facts. After the Gospel of John was written, Gnostics wrote a text called the Secret Book of John. After the Christian book of James was written, Gnostics wrote a text called the Secret Book of James. After some of the Gospels had been written, Gnostics wrote a text known today as the Gospel of Thomas, which claimed to be, quote, "the secret sayings that the living Jesus spoke and Didymus Judas Thomas recorded." End quote. Many of the early Gnostic texts were just like this, very obviously conspiratorial bootleg versions of original Christian texts, and the reason for this was that the earliest Gnostics were mainly Christians. Gnostic secrecy was also reflected in the manner of its transmission. Whereas Christianity, as a public religion, was taught publicly in the street, the marketplace, the open squares, the Jewish synagogues, or in private homes which were made open to the public, Gnostic teachings were taught in private spaces, which were typically made open only to a chosen few, so they could be taught special secrets. Whereas Christian teachings were taught to all Christians, regardless of status, Gnostic teachings were considered secret for all but the specially initiated, and the titles and content of Gnostic works reflect this. The Gospel of the Egyptians says the God saith, quote, "prepared for himself secretly through the Virgin, in order that the saints may be begotten by the Holy Spirit through invisible secret symbols." End quote. The text called Three Forms of First Thought similarly emphasizes the importance of secret Gnostic teachings being transmitted, saying, quote, "he revealed what is hard to interpret and what is secret." End quote. The text called the Sophia, or Wisdom of Jesus Christ, likewise speaks of, quote, "everything that the Saviour is doing with them in the secret of the holy plan." End quote. This secrecy is why Gnostic texts are confined almost exclusively to a few geographical areas, mainly Alexandria. Unlike the Christians, the Gnostics weren't sharing their texts around, writing open letters to people about what they believed, and enabling non-believers to own and copy their texts. there has been so much scholarship on Gnosticism since Vogelin's time that it's totally unnecessary to even read him on the subject. He just didn't know about it. Professor Emeritus Eugene Webb, cited previously, who has studied and responded to Vogelin's works since at least the 1980s, explains that not only was Vogelin ignorant about Gnosticism, he was also ignorant of another development of mystic thought called Hermeticism, which we've heard about previously, writing, quote, "The pattern of thought and symbolism known as Hermeticism, which Vogelin and many others once lumped together with other phenomena under the single heading of Gnosticism, is actually very different from what that word has usually been used to mean." End quote. This is important since, as we'll see in a later video, TIK makes the same mistakes with Hermeticism as he does with Gnosticism, relying on James Lindsay and Eric Vogelin and failing to do any proper historical research himself. Webb is a particularly useful commenter on Vogelin, not only because he followed Vogelin's work so closely, but because he interacted with him repeatedly. One account of Vogelin Webb tells is, quote, "For one thing, he said at a conference on Gnosticism and modernity at Vanderbilt University in 1978 that he would probably not use that term if he was starting over again, because besides what then went by that name, the ideas he was interested in using it to address included many other strands, such as apocalypticism, alchemy, magic, theurgy, and scientism." End quote. Webb also notes that when the Nag Hammadi texts were discovered, Vogelin expressed hope that his views of Gnosticism would be vindicated. Webb comments wryly, quote, "Evidently, he thought the discovery of actual Gnostic texts would confirm and augment what he had been using the term to say." End quote. Of course, the Nag Hammadi texts proved to be a complete disappointment to Vogelin, mainly because none of them supported his views of Gnosticism, and partly also because he had almost no opportunity to study them himself, so his commentary on Gnosticism remained hopelessly out of date. Webb writes, quote, "But in fact, in 1962, hardly any of that material had yet been edited and translated, and the bulk of it was not generally available until 1977 with the publication of the Nag Hammadi Library in English. So Vogelin himself had probably seen little of the actual texts except the Gospel according to Thomas, which had been published with a great deal of publicity in 1959, but which had little bearing on any of the topics Vogelin had been concerned with in his own use of the term." End quote. So, what have we learned in this video? 1. Eric Vogelin, on whom TIK is relying very heavily for his own ideas about Gnosticism, was almost totally ignorant of the subject. 2. Vogelin relied on secondary sources who were also almost totally ignorant of Gnosticism. 3. Vogelin's views on Gnosticism were being debunked by the discovery of actual Gnostic texts while he was still alive, to the extent that he knew his original view was unsustainable. 4. There is no evidence Gnosticism predates Christianity or survived into the Middle Ages, let alone into the 20th century. The very fact that its most fanatical Christian opponents stopped talking about it after the 5th century, and the absence of Gnostic texts after that period, is strong evidence for this. Most importantly, we've learned to fact-check our sources. Don't be intimidated by TIK's long list of sources. He may not have read them all. Don't be impressed just because he's putting citations on screen and reading them in an authoritative tone. His sources may be junk, and he may not even know. And please treat my videos in exactly the same way. People often comment on how they appreciate the fact that I quote sources directly and cite them on screen, but I know from the number of questions I receive that almost no one clicks on the link to my references in the video description, and I'm absolutely certain hardly anyone is following up on my sources and checking them for validity. It has happened a few times, most commonly on a couple of my very short videos, and I should make a video about that, showing how important it is to really take care with your sources, especially when you're researching in a field well outside your own area of knowledge. That's a trap I had fortunately avoided on one occasion when someone called me to account for the sources in my video. But that's a story for another time.